All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce now Shira Frankel of the New York Times for a conversation about critical infrastructure and resiliency.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for our panel. I'm going to start by saying that I moved back to the United States 3 years ago after 10 years abroad, and I couldn't believe how much America had changed. The very fabric of society had been altered. People were introducing devices, internet-connected devices, into their lives in a way that I could never have imagined. And our cities and our infrastructure have had to rush to meet that challenge. So with that in mind, we have a great panel here of people that represent private sector and government to talk about whether we can meet that challenge. Right, so I'm gonna start by asking you, where do you think we are now as opposed to 5 years ago? Have we gotten better? Are our devices protected? Are our cities protected?
Do you want this?
I thought it was the private.
Let's start with,
I
love the public sector view. We didn't sit up here this way, but go ahead.
I can start. So I think in a lot of ways, we've made a lot of improvement. I bet a lot of you don't know that November is actually National Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Month. Mm-hmm. Yay! Some of us knew it. October was National Cyber Awareness Month, and November is actually Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Awareness Month. It doesn't roll off the tongue super easy, but I do think we've made a lot of progress over the years. I think from a DHS perspective, we've seen a lot more general awareness of the issue of needing to build and maintain more resilient critical infrastructure, both the systems and actually the physical side of it too. Learning from things like when we recover from a hurricane, let's rebuild things more secure and resilient than they were in the first place. And so we've made a lot of progress in specific areas. One of the things that was really important to us that we felt that we were missing was that sort of national picture of what is national risk. And so over the past year and a half or so, we've been thinking a lot about, how do we define that? What does that look like? And in our first ever annual Cyber Summit in July, the Secretary announced the stand-up of the National Risk Management Center. And our focus is really about lots of great work going on in different industries, in different disciplines, but DHS really needed to be the place that was going to focus on defining and working to mitigate national risk, and doing that through this center. And we're looking at it, and it's not just a cyber thing, but it's really trying to take a big step back and understand in the first order, what are the functions that our country depends upon. We're calling those national critical functions. And we're working with industry to work with us to define what those mean. So we've worked with the IT sector, the communications, financial sector, energy, emergency services, and going to them and saying, what are the core functions that your industry or your sector provides that, and then going through that analysis of, okay, well, what's the risk to those functions? How could an adversary disrupt them? And because that's how they're thinking, right? They're not thinking about how do I get into this company unless that company is a part of a larger delivery of service or function that they care about holding at risk or disrupting. And so that's really been our big focus, and I'm happy to say, much of industry has welcomed that and is working with us on that, and so it's really trying to change that so we can think about the function of our country and how we protect that against adversaries who would seek to disrupt or disable those, and that's where I think the big gaps are that we need to go in the future.
So let me add to that, since I spent a lot of time in government and now I've been out in the private sector for almost 5 years. I think we've made incredible advancements, both in the government side and on the private sector side. The issue is, though, that technology has changed at such a rapid pace, I'm not sure we're safer. And if you look at Moore's Law and what is happening with technology, and those of you who kind of remember, I used to be a programmer many moons ago, and it was in an IBM mainframe. right? We went to the deck and wing. Those of you who remember the minis, then to the laptops. Now we've gone to the cloud. We've done a full revolution. Now we're going out to the edge again, to IoT and the computing power there. And that evolution is happening at such a rapid pace. I do worry that where all those great gains that many of the people here have been part of, I worry that we're falling behind.
So as the CISO for Verizon and working for a company where resiliency is part of our DNA, and it's something I'm personally very passionate about, I do believe that we have made great strides over the last several years in terms of across industries, and especially in critical infrastructure, in terms of our resiliency. However, I am concerned as we think about the fourth industrial revolution, the proliferation of the new emerging technology, and that the security may not keep pace with it, and not all companies in all industries may be doing security by design concurrent with the adoption of that emerging technology, that we're in a position where we could put ourselves more at risk. Not that we can't come back up the curve again as we implement those technologies and do better, and I'm speaking more broadly across various industries that we have an opportunity as Verizon to view and see. I will go ahead right now and put the plug in around 5G. There's been a lot of concern about the security about 5G, and as I sit here before you, we've had numerous discussions, not only Verizon as well as our industry partners that are implementing 5G and the security around it. We are very confident in the security of 5G itself. The technology, the open standards it's based on, and the suppliers that we're using to be able to deliver that. We're more focused on IoT and the types of devices that are going to be connected into our network and the security of those. And so I think as we go forward, as some of the earlier panels have said, we'll have to focus on the resiliency of those and making sure our networks can operate in spite of what those devices may be doing.
If I may, I think where this question's moved to is where do we see progress, and then where do we need to go? And I think in order to address both those topics, it might be helpful for the audience for me to explain a little bit about the progress in New York City. So in New York City, when you think about the progress against the cybersecurity matter, what have we done? Well, we think about it in really two ways. We think about it when it comes to our enterprise mission. What's that enterprise mission? Well, we're in a city right now. And right now, all of us as visitors or as people that live here or people that have families here, these wonderful children playing that we can hear on the other side of the wall, they all expect services to be delivered via technology, successfully, reliably, each and every day. Some of those services are absolutely critical. What have we done in New York City? In New York City, we've consolidated the cybersecurity effort into the organization that I'm accountable for, New York City Cyber Command. That is the center of gravity for how the city government approaches a cybersecurity problem across many, many different agencies. Agencies that are at the tips of everyone's tongue. So everything from the public safety agencies to health and human services, finance, water utility, and beyond. So we've consolidated the mission to one organization that has the authority to not just produce administrative controls, but technical controls, and a number of other things. You can look up the founding charter and the mayor's Executive Order 28 released last year. So we've consolidated the mission, and that is absolutely critical in how you're going to approach the mission. The other thing we've done is recognize that cybersecurity is very much a public safety issue and an essential service for New Yorkers. So we have the enterprise mission, but now what we have said is our government has a role to bring cybersecurity to the public. And we've taken strides, we've progressed in that as well. Like, what have we done? First off, we set up principles. The principles are the most important piece of it, and we've advocated for those principles. We've discussed those principles with New Yorkers. We've announced those principles. What are they? Public safety is, cybersecurity is a public safety issue. It is an essential service, and everything that we do on behalf of cybersecurity for New Yorkers will respect their privacy. We've also decided to, debut our first two tactics in that space. We've taken a step, partnering with an NGO that built a solution respecting privacy called Quad 9, and have made a commitment that by the end of this year, we will deploy that solution for all the places whereby we provide public accessible Wi-Fi. So we're on that journey. The other thing we did is a couple of weeks ago, we released an app. Very simple app. It's free, and it was built with privacy by design. We put the app in the App Store about 3 weeks ago. It's called NYC Secure. And what does this do? This allows us to say to the New Yorker, we need to not just bring you awareness, but as you conduct your life in the digital domain, we need to give you tools to help navigate away from threats. So when you think about it, New York City has already made substantive progress in its enterprise mission and its public safety mission. Now, where do we need to go? The city, as a center of commerce across the globe, is a city that needs to embrace technology. It needs to continue to embrace technology. It needs to be, some people use this term cognitive city, smart city. And in order to enable, through those new technologies that people will plug into our city, in order to enable success, we have to do so safely. And that's the journey that we have in front of us that we can talk about today.
Let me, Jeff, I think you raise a good point, and I think the city of New York has made a kind of a giant step where they've coordinated that all under you. And so one of the things I see in the federal government is that decentralization causes a lot of issues. So when Michael Daniels was there and Rob Joyce was there from a policy coordination standpoint, I think that helped unify a lot of what the federal government was doing. I tell you, I have two concerns. I think the model that exists right now in the government doesn't work. And I come from one of those agencies, right? And I think we have to make that step where we're all sitting in one place. And I think they're missing an important piece, and that's the private sector, right? And this is, I think, a paradigm and a shift that we have not been able to cope with because we're thinking of it in the old way and not looking at the new way. And that's where I think some of these changes have to be made.
So that actually leads to my next question, which is we've heard you talk about security by design and private companies taking it upon themselves to create standards. And we've heard of talk of, on a federal level, the government should be regulating this. There should be certain standards around what is expected of cities and of private companies. And I'm curious, what model do you think should exist going forward to ensure that nationally there's a certain standard of security applied across the board?
I can start. I think it depends on what you're talking about. If you're kind of talking about Internet of Things, I think that it would harken back to, what's currently the model for, if you buy a microwave, it's got a little UL seal, and you know that it has gone through a series of testing and it's compliant to certain specifications, so it's not going to blow up in your face. And I think when you're talking about all of these connected devices, which is really just the next generation of these types of electronics, they just happen to be connected, is having some sort of industry-driven model, whether it's Underwriter Laboratory that continues to take that on, or something else, where you have these set of specifications and compliance associated with that. The notion of the government regulating Internet of Things isn't particularly appealing to me, and so I think that having that industry-based model. If you're talking about broader kind of security, most critical infrastructure is already regulated when it comes to security and safety. Some of them have more cyber-specific pieces of that, some of them don't. And so the notion that we aren't regulating when it comes to these things is not true. They are already regulated, and what we're working on is how do we harmonize those regulations so that it's focused on risk management, not compliance checklists, and how do we ensure that we do that smartly. But I think regulation is a way to address gaps in kind of this risk management. Who's doing what to whom. If the government thinks that there are gaps that the market's not covering down on, I don't think that we fully made that assessment that that's the case. But that's obviously a topic of debate for many folks. But I don't think a regulatory framework is going to solve this particular challenge.
To the rest of the panelists, do you think the regulation we have right now is enough? Is it too much? Should the private sector be doing more?
You wanted more regulation, right?
I want regulation where it's going to help companies do the things that they should be doing anyway, I think it's a business imperative to do cyber. I think it's socially responsible. I think when you talk specifically about critical infrastructure industries, of which I'm a part, and the services Verizon provides, supports many industries, and especially the critical infrastructure ones. When I think about resiliency, I'm more interested in what we're doing with the DHS risk management framework and trying to look at those national critical functions, because if you think about resiliency, so many companies have been doing resiliency for themselves and for the products and services that they offer, that we are in this ultra hyper-connected world right now. And so I'm excited about the work we're doing with the Tri-Sector Working Group, where we're bringing the communications, the electricity, and the financial services teams together to look at an operational collaboration framework, because I'm dependent. Verizon's dependent on the grid. I need power. And if I don't have the grid power, I need to be able to deliver fuel to my generators so that I can create power to run our networks and systems. And so to me, it's more about how do we crystallize and understand the interconnectedness of these critical functions that we have. And regulation's not going to get at that, because the knowledge around that and the expertise exists within the private industry firms themselves.
I would just add, though, I'm kind of on Bruce's camp here on regulation. Like, it's about economic units. Companies are in business to make money, right? So the lower cost of goods is what, unfortunately, they're going to strive for in most cases, right? There are industries, I think, and exceptions, but if you look at FSMA and you look at the defense industrial base, they do a lot of the requirements because they have to. And that's one of the reasons why I think they're some of the best companies in cybersecurity and basic hygiene. I go into many, many companies where those basics, and that's where I think you need regulation, I think you need legislation. And it doesn't help to have 50 states doing 50 different state laws, right? So I think there's some common denominator there where that regulation helps, but then I think it gets to specifics on industries and really the relevance they have to life safety and other things.
But if I could add, on the federal side, one of the things that we've been talking a lot in terms of supply chain risk, which more accurately is probably third-party risk from the IT services and products that we buy, is we really did a hard look, and there was not a sort of a concept of the security being baked into those contracts that you were writing. And to think about that risk that you are accepting through these procurement vehicles. And so I think there's a lot of ways to drive better security practices by being smarter consumers, by being more, thinking maybe lowest price technically acceptable isn't always the best way to get a very secure product. But I think specifically around regulation, I mean, we've been issuing a series of directives to all federal agencies. We told them they all got to adopt DMARC. They all have to move off of weak ciphers. And a series of things that because of us doing that, those weren't written into contracts, despite the fact that those were policies that had been promulgated by OMB and NIST for some time. And it was not getting down to that actual mission manager who's thinking about what is this human capital system that I'm about to procure? What risk could that actually introduce to my business and the government, the business of delivering services to our citizens? And so it's I guess where I sort of bristle is the notion that what would I regulate? Would I regulate that, hey, by the way, guys, this cipher is weak. We're going to regulate that you all move to the next one. That wouldn't be a very sustainable sort of process. So that's sort of where I'm concerned about. Is it's got to be a risk management approach to it. I think in some sectors they've tried risk-based performance standards. I know we've done that in the chemical sector and a couple of others. That there's some usefulness with that. But I worry about the specificity that would drive us towards this very much compliance. Well, I checked all these boxes that you told me to do, but the boxes were from technology that was 5 years old, knowing how fast the government runs. So I'm open to other ideas, but that's sort of where I
And I'd be interested in Jeff. I mean, New York, we know with the DFS regulations, what are your thoughts?
So I think to a certain extent, when contemplating regulation within the space, it needs to be part of a greater system. And by greater system, I mean, when you think about a city and what drives a city, there's all kinds of different incentives. You can have our academic community that's producing the talent. You can have our small business community and our large private sector enterprises, right? And to a certain extent, if regulation is to be brought to bear, I think you need to examine how you incentivize that entire system to function better and to function, not in a manner where you are pushing towards more and more compliant regimes. So I do think to a certain extent there is, to the points of the earlier panel, a very significant consideration to be made between carrot and stick. And there are times when stick is certainly necessary. But to a certain extent, if you can use smart regulation to then incentivize the core drivers of that economic system within your city or within the body that you're trying to regulate, you'll be in a much better place. And perhaps you can look at things like how to, make a way to have your academic institutions, your educational programs, your drivers of innovation, which is, somewhere hubbed between, that person graduating and starting the job that builds the technology, and then line that with a need to check for the safety of the thing that they have created, then you might not necessarily only be using the stick. You'll be incentivizing, the growth of the economic opportunity that our industry represents.
I think I would just add, the regulation we need needs to help us raise the water in terms of security, but to an earlier point that you made, it becomes challenging for companies of any size to deal with 50 different versions of something, and then how do you actually implement it so you can be fully compliant at all times. And so, and that reconciliation with that. And that's something that I think that private industry companies, have to deal with at all levels, whether it's international, whether it's here domestically, at the federal, state, or even at the local level, how companies are able to, meet the requirements. And with security resources being scarce, I'm talking broadly across companies and various industries, we want them spending the money on getting the security in and not in the, audit checking and reporting. We really want them doing the work that they may not be doing right now, and doing that work versus trying to decipher and correlate and matrix 50 different sets of requirements.
And, part of this panel discussion is also meant to be about resiliency. So I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask you what needs to be done to create a more resilient society, more resilient cities, more resilient companies.
So I'll start on that one because, again, we're in a city, so we should care a lot about the resiliencies of the services we depend on, right? And I think to a certain extent it is, as a representative of the city government of New York, we are very mindful of what we need to do to make sure our technology enables those services. But we are one significant piece, but we are one piece of all the different pieces that make up a successful city. And I think when we think about resiliency, part of the risk in that equation is what is everyone else doing and what is everyone else not doing, because when it comes down to it, New Yorkers expect services from their city, but they also expect a lot of other places to be delivering them services to have, to have a successful day.
So, I will just add, I think this resiliency term doesn't just belong with cyber, right? I think it's a broader term, and in the private sector, I think it's about business resiliency. In DoD, I read a white paper really about mission kind of effectiveness and how that plays in the mission space. And I would just tell you, How many of us, right, we've for the last decade more have heard about data breaches, and we talk about all the companies and the brand reputation and the risk that they go from there. Now let's jump to NotPetya. Almost took down a company to its knees and could take it out, right? That to me gets to the heart of what we should be thinking about. Data exfiltration is a minor thing compared to the damage that that did. So we need to look at, I think, business operations, not at the cyber level, right? We're looking at what are the critical business services that exist and how are you making them resilient? How are you looking at those critical business services and understanding the interdependencies? How are you looking at those interdependencies and understanding how they are being digitally supported? That is where I think we're actually, a lot of companies are starting to pivot. I think the military has already done that, and really looking at this in really a different frame.
Yeah, I think I think the business process resiliency is a key facet to that. I think, as I think about it in the seat that I'm in, providing the network and connectivity services, it's interesting because I think our services are tiered in terms of their criticality and their impact on our national security, right? Although I can tell you some of our users think streaming the Super Bowl to their mobile phone is a critical service. But in all seriousness, there's a set of services that we have that Verizon provides that are truly critical, and interdependencies with other sectors that mean that we're able to provide those services in the face of an unprecedented disaster. I'm really interested in, and where I have concerns and think about resiliency is, you know, we've done resiliency within our own box, our own sector. We need to do more in terms of the cross-sector collaboration. But if you think about an unprecedented attack that was a blended kinetic cyber attack where you had data integrity or disinformation issues that could create chaos, I don't think we're as prepared across the critical infrastructure sector components, and even working with the cities and state municipalities to be able to collectively respond in a very orchestrated way, although DHS plays a significant role in the orchestration of that. And so I think there's a lot more work to do. It's interesting from a cyber perspective, companies are now moving to combining business resiliency and cyber, and you're starting to see CISOs also take on and become like either the executive champion or the executive responsible for business resiliency within the company. Because most CEOs know that there's, you know, if you think about the things that they could be fired for, this is like, cyber's one of them. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think, you know, resilience is something that's really core to us, and you know, something that our secretary has actually personally worked on quite a bit in previous life. And you know, between this, you know, the kind of the twin pieces of risk management and the resilience, you know, the way I think about resilience is the ability to bounce back quickly and ideally even stronger than before. And particularly in the communication sector, which is where I had a lot of experience, is you know, the capabilities that have been able to be built up to bring communications back up after a disaster is quite phenomenal, and probably not particularly well known. But you know, ideally, you have a lot of time to plan for these sorts of things, so that does help. But being able to have both the technical and the operational plans, playbooks, the understanding of who's going to do what, to be able to build that kind of quick bounce back from any situation we have to be able to apply that in cyber. And again, sort of but it's not just cyber, it's just cyber. It's kind of that vector that is, I think, challenging us. And so for us, we kind of go back to these critical functions as sort of the cornerstone for us. Is if you have these set of critical functions, and by the way, when I'm talking about critical functions, I mean something like, you know, electricity that is generated that we can depend upon, and you know, elections, and these sorts of these high-level critical functions for our country. And if you have these defined set of functions that we all agree upon, and then who's doing what, to prevent an actor from disrupting or denying those functions or holding them at risk in some way. And then who's doing what to be able to be in a position to mitigate the consequences from going to that extreme scenario that we're all concerned about. And I think in particular, the elections have really taught us, it's kind of forced us to get out of that traditional cybersecurity kind of hacking into the system, but that an adversary can do different things to, even when you start talking about public confidence. A lot of our critical services and functions, there's a really core public confidence element to that. And so it's really started to challenge us to think about, if we understand these functions and we can think about different ways that an adversary would be able to disrupt or even have a perception that those functions have been disrupted, what do we do as the US government to position our intelligence community, to position ourselves, to position all the various different tools that the government has available to us, all of our like-minded countries that want to see this, amazing great thing called the internet remain as an amazing great thing. How do we kind of work together to, to put ourselves in this better position? And then to your last point, or I guess it was kind of your first point around societal resilience, is being able to talk to the public and helping them understand what's real, what's not, and how do they understand what the government is doing about it, and having sort of the public, transparent conversation, I think is really important to start to build a population who is taking advantage of all of this digital infrastructure and everything that's available to it, but also have a population that is resilient and can understand these attacks for what they are.
So I think you touched on a good point about society and how they're responding to different things. And we have to put into our equation and thinking, we've seen a lot of different behaviors with our citizens and our users of our devices. When someone doesn't have their mobile service, we see them leaving a place of safety and going out into an area where there could be damage and trying to find some way to connect and communicate. And so that brings, in terms of that resilience and recovery, understanding how people will respond in that moment, and then being able to recover services in a way so that you're not having any more damage or any other public safety issues than you would want to have.
That's a critical component. So when it comes down to it, in order to be resilient, you need to have public trust. And you need to have a discourse with that trust. Each and every day, New Yorkers expect their city government to earn their trust every day. And I think to a certain extent, I can answer, and I answered before in our principles, how we articulate what we should be held accountable against in order to earn that trust each and every day. But everybody needs to articulate that. And I think to a certain extent, in the technology spaces that we've seen in the last 2 years, I think there is some movement to be had when it comes to how people ask their questions within their companies and to themselves, like, do I trust the thing I am using, right? And that's a very, very important question.
On that last point, since we have just a couple minutes left, do you think people do ask themselves, can I trust the thing that I'm bringing into my home? Can I trust the application that I've downloaded on my iPhone? I'm curious, would the four of you bring internet-connected devices into your home? If you, this Christmas, receive a coffee maker that can communicate with your phone and get your coffee ready on the dot, would you plug that coffee maker in?
Absolutely.
Are you
I have
serious?
devices.
I am totally serious.
Are you serious?
Yes.
I have
Would you
devices,
bring?
yes.
You're security professionals. I'm curious whether you introduce internet-connected devices into your homes and trust them.
They're already there.
I will
Yep.
be honest, I
They're
don't.
already
I love technology. I grew up with, our first computer was a Commodore 64. And, I absolutely love it. My dad was a programmer, and, it's just, and so I love all the technology. But, I don't even have a digital watch. And it's not really because of, it's a variety of things, but I think it's partly just because of everything that you hear and you read, and you definitely have some concerns there. But I think as we have more demonstrable security in these devices that I, as a consumer, can understand and have confidence in, I definitely will be open to buying more.
So it's interesting. So I don't have any choice between my wife and children of whether I'm bringing in IoT devices. But I do think that it comes down to that trust you're talking about. And as our economy goes more to that sharing economy, when you call up that Uber app, you're trusting that you're getting in a car with someone, right? If your kids, if you let them share your credit card for that Uber app, which I bet some of you do, I have to confess I do, right? We're trusting that driver. Airbnb, we're trusting that host. And it goes into, and if you've seen in Silicon Valley lately, I think Matt Olson is here. I think his title is Trust Officer or Trust and Safety Officer of Uber. Facebook is looking for a trust officer, right? So we're seeing this as a foundational aspect as we move into the sharing economy.
Absolutely. Great. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. We're out of time, and appreciate you all joining us today.
That was great. Good job.